this episode, we focus on something that sounds simple until you try to defend it in front of a reviewer: how often documentation reviews and training must happen. Frequency is not just a scheduling preference, because many frameworks, policies, and contractual requirements expect periodic review and refresher training as evidence that controls are living, not frozen in time. If you set the frequency too loosely, you risk stale policies, outdated procedures, and staff who no longer remember how to handle sensitive information correctly. If you set the frequency too aggressively, you can create a compliance program that collapses under its own weight, where reviews are rushed, training becomes checkbox behavior, and evidence is low quality. The skill is to set frequencies that meet requirements, align with system impact and risk, and are realistic for the organization's capacity, while still producing proof that a control remains in force over time. The goal here is to help you understand how to choose defensible review and training frequencies, how to document them so they are testable, and how to avoid the common traps that lead to findings. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is recognizing that documentation review and training frequency are both forms of continuous control operation, even though they do not look like technical monitoring. Documentation review is how you ensure that policies, procedures, system descriptions, and control narratives still match reality and still meet current requirements. Training is how you ensure that the people who operate and use the system understand their responsibilities and can carry out procedures correctly. Both are about preventing drift, because drift happens in two places: systems change and people forget. If your documentation never changes while your system evolves, your compliance story becomes false, even if the system is secure, because the record no longer matches the environment. If your training is not refreshed, people gradually return to habit, and habit is often where mishandling occurs, especially under pressure. Setting frequency is therefore a risk control, not just administrative routine. When you frame it that way, frequency decisions feel more purposeful and less arbitrary. To set frequency that meets requirements, you first identify what the requirements actually are, because some requirements are explicit while others are implied. An explicit requirement might say policies are reviewed at least annually, training is provided upon hire and at least annually, or specific procedures are reviewed on a defined cadence. An implied requirement might be that documentation must be kept current, which means review must occur frequently enough to catch changes before they become compliance problems. In practice, organizations often have internal policy standards that set minimum review cycles, and those internal standards may be stricter than the external framework baseline. You need to treat the strictest applicable requirement as the floor, because compliance is about meeting the binding expectations, not about choosing what feels reasonable. The selected framework's language matters, but so do organizational policies, contracts, and regulator expectations where applicable. A defensible frequency decision begins with showing you know the minimum required cadence and that your plan meets or exceeds it. Once minimum requirements are known, you tailor frequency based on risk and impact rather than applying the same schedule to everything. Some documents and training topics are foundational and should be reviewed on a predictable schedule even if little changes, because they define how the system is governed. Other documents are tightly coupled to technical reality, such as system architecture descriptions and control implementation narratives, and those may need review triggered by change, as well as periodic review. A practical approach is to treat frequency as having two components: a calendar cadence and an event-driven cadence. The calendar cadence ensures that even if no one notices changes, documents and training are revisited at least on schedule. The event-driven cadence ensures that when meaningful changes happen, you do not wait for the next annual date to update critical documentation or refresh training on new procedures. This dual cadence is often more realistic than trying to set one number for everything. It also aligns with how systems actually change, because change rarely waits for a convenient review cycle. For documentation reviews, It helps to understand that not all documentation serves the same purpose, and that purpose can influence how strict review frequency needs to be. High-level policies define expectations and authority, and they often change slowly, but they still need periodic review to confirm they remain aligned with current law, organizational structure, and risk tolerance. Procedures, such as how access is granted or how incidents are handled, may change more often because tools, teams, and workflows evolve, so they benefit from a more active review approach. System-specific control narratives and evidence descriptions are especially sensitive to drift because they must match real implementation, and implementation changes frequently. If you review those narratives only annually while the system changes monthly, your documentation will almost certainly become inaccurate. A strong strategy recognizes which documents are stable and which are dynamic, and it sets frequency accordingly while still meeting any minimum policy requirements. The defensibility comes from tying frequency to change rate and risk, not from treating all documents as equal. Training frequency has a similar pattern, because not all training content has the same risk profile and not all users need the same depth. Everyone who uses a system may need basic training on data handling expectations, acceptable use, and reporting of suspicious activity. People with privileged access or operational responsibilities often need more frequent or more specific training because their actions have higher impact. For example, administrators might need refreshers on secure change practices and incident escalation steps, while general users might need refreshers on recognizing and avoiding common mishandling situations like sharing data improperly. Training also needs to occur at moments when it will actually change behavior, such as onboarding new staff before they receive access and providing targeted training when procedures change. If you rely only on a yearly training event, you may meet a minimum requirement but still leave large gaps when new staff join mid-year or when a process changes significantly. A defensible training strategy uses both scheduled refreshers and triggered training when roles or procedures change. That approach aligns training with real operational needs rather than with a calendar alone. One of the biggest mistakes in frequency setting is choosing a number and then failing to define what completion actually means. Saying documents are reviewed quarterly does not mean anything unless you define what constitutes a review, who performs it, what they check, and what record is kept. A review should at least confirm accuracy, confirm alignment with current requirements, and capture updates or decisions to keep content unchanged. Similarly, saying training is annual does not mean much unless you define what training includes, who must complete it, how completion is tracked, and what happens when someone does not complete it on time. Frequency is only testable when it produces evidence. Evidence might be an approved review record, a version history entry, or a training completion record, but whatever the evidence is, it must be consistent and retrievable. Assessors do not evaluate frequency claims. They evaluate proof that the cadence is real. A good frequency decision is therefore paired with an evidence plan that makes adherence easy to demonstrate. Another common trap is setting frequencies that are technically compliant but operationally unrealistic, which leads to rushed, low-quality reviews and meaningless training. For example, if you require monthly reviews of complex documentation but no one has time to do them properly, the reviews become superficial signatures. That creates a false sense of compliance and undermines trust in the evidence. Similarly, if training is repeated too frequently with the same content and no relevance, learners tune out and completion becomes a check-the-box routine that does not change behavior. A mature strategy sets frequencies that people can actually execute, and then strengthens effectiveness by improving the quality of what happens during reviews and training. It is better to have a realistic cadence that is followed consistently with good records than an aggressive cadence that exists only on paper. Consistency is a major indicator of a healthy compliance program, and frequency choices should support consistency rather than sabotage it. Because frequency decisions must meet requirements, you also need a way to handle conflicting requirements and decide which one governs. Sometimes the framework suggests one cadence, organizational policy requires another, and a contract may require a third. In that situation, the safest approach is usually to adopt the most stringent requirement for the relevant scope, but you may also tailor by role or document category if allowed, as long as you can show all requirements are met for the things they apply to. The key is to avoid silently choosing the easiest cadence and hoping no one notices. A defensible approach documents which requirement applies, why it applies, and how your chosen cadence satisfies it. If you adopt a stricter cadence, you should also make sure the organization can support it, because compliance is not only about writing a number, but about maintaining it over time. If the stricter cadence is not feasible, you may need to adjust resourcing or request a formal exception through governance processes, because frequency is a control parameter and exceptions must be treated as risk decisions. By the end of this lesson, the main outcome is that you can set review and training frequencies that meet requirements while also being realistic and defensible. You understand that documentation review prevents drift between what is written and what is real, and training prevents drift between what people know and what they do. You use minimum requirements as the floor, then tailor frequency based on impact, risk, and change rate, often using both calendar-based and event-driven triggers. You define what a review and a training completion actually mean and how evidence is captured so the cadence can be tested during assessment. You avoid the traps of unrealistic schedules that produce low-quality evidence or overly sparse schedules that allow stale documentation and forgotten responsibilities. When you choose frequencies with this disciplined approach, you make continued compliance smoother because the organization has a predictable rhythm that keeps controls, documentation, and people aligned with requirements over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.